And welcome back. Now, COVID-19, notwithstanding its devastating impact on the health and economies of African countries, could be an opportunity to advance economic development on the continent. Now, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which was signed in 2018 at an African Union gathering in Rwanda, could be the best instrument to carry out this objective. And these are the views of Professor Faizel Ismail, who's the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. The implementation of the free trade area has the potential to grow African countries in a more developmental and inclusive as well as mutually beneficial way. And the free trade area agreement was supposed to come into effect in July this year, but had to be postponed due to COVID-19. Professor Faizel Ismail joins us now via Zoom. Professor, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Sakina.
Professor, firstly, through this agreement, Africa's 55 countries have the potential of being the largest trading bloc. And you say this provides, of course, an opportunity for us to actually redefine who we are as a continent. But COVID-19 leading to the postponement of the starting date of that particular agreement in July. So will Africa still be ready to push through with this free trade area this year or next year, looking at the way things are right now?
Yes. This week on Monday, it was Africa Day, the 25th of May. We hosted, the Mandela School hosted a webinar with a large number of African intellectuals and policymakers. It included the new Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area, Mr. Mene. So we debated the question of the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Agreement in the context of the current crisis. And the Secretary General assured us that the Free Trade Agreement is still a major priority for the African Union. However, because African leaders are now concerned, of course, mainly with saving lives and addressing the pandemic, they've had to postpone the implementation to sometime early next year. But there's no doubt that what the crisis, this crisis has also underlined are not only the weaknesses, the underlying weaknesses of the continent, but also the imperative for African countries to work together. So the weaknesses, relate to the global context, because what we have learned in the last few months is that the dependence of Africa for global markets, its reliance on commodity exports and reliance on markets in the West, that's in Europe and the US, and in the East in China, this dependence is actually not sustainable, because we've seen a disruption of global value chains, we've seen a fall of commodity prices, but we've also seen another contradiction in the world system. The biggest countries in the world have restricted their exports of vital, essential products like pharmaceutical products, equipment like ventilators, and in some cases, even food products. And these are now critical for Africa to address its health pandemic. So the only solution for Africa is to rely on itself, to work together, and to accelerate the process of regional integration. And this understanding, I think, has now permeated the whole continent. There's a greater understanding that we must work together, we must collaborate. And there are a number of opportunities. And in the paper that I wrote for the conversation, I have listed a number of those. So the first one is clearly pharmaceuticals. We have to work together. We have to join forces, not only through the African Center for Disease Control, but also entrepreneurs working together to build the necessary products that we require to address the health pandemic. Also prepare for the medium to long term. Begin to build regional value chains in areas like food and agricultural, food processing. But also, hospitals need to be built, and educational facilities, water and sanitation. These have become critical to the current pandemic, and individual African countries are not able to do that on their own. But if we work together, we can fast track the implementation of these. So these are some of the new opportunities that have been highlighted by the current crisis, and it makes the importance of the African free trade area, more, it underlines that, and it has increased the commitment of African countries to advance this free trade agreement.
Professor Ismail, if we look at most of these views, they aren't exactly brand new. Stimulating of industrial development on the continent, raising of welfare on the continent, those date back to the ideals of the then OAU during its formation in 1963. So why haven't we been able to make good, steady progress in this regard? And what's new now? How are things now better positioned to change?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. There is a long history, of course, of African countries trying to unite from the Organization of African Unity, which was created in 1963. And subsequently, we've had attempts, in the 1980s and the 1990s, the creation of the Abuja Treaty by Secretary General of the Economic Commission of Africa, Adedeji Adebayo. But in the 80s, and African countries were in severe economic crisis. They had high levels of debt, low levels of growth. We had 2 lost decades, not helped, of course, by the World Bank and the IMF structural adjustment policies, which exacerbated the crisis. But, things changed in the early part of this millennium. From about early 2000, African countries started growing. And between 2000 and about 2010, African countries were growing at about 5% on average across the continent. An amazing turnaround. And it's in the wake of this kind of new revival of African economies that the free trade agreement was born. We've never seen the commitment we have seen in Africa for countries to work together. So the process of negotiations over the last few years has been incredibly resilient. We've seen a determination by presidents working together with their constituencies. They've driven this process forward, and in record time, 55 countries have been able to reach agreement on a free trade agreement. It's a great pity that we've now had this external shock to the system, well, globally, but also in Africa, and it has delayed, of course, the implementation. But interestingly, this crisis is also highlighting the imperative of integration. So yes, a lot has changed, and there are a lot more factors that now contribute to the realization that integration has to happen, and there is a greater political determination for this to take place. So I think that we have a great opportunity. And South Africa too has become much more reliant on the continent for its own exports. In fact, the largest number of jobs that are created through our exports are created from our trade with Africa.
So when we speak to these opportunities, there are several elephants in the room. Looking at some of them, good governance, ethical leadership. How are we going to deal with that? And how is that likely to actually hamper these imperatives that we currently have on the table?
This is a very important issue. I have highlighted that as, a very important process that must take place alongside the free trade process. we must work together to strengthen democratic institutions on the continent. What's very interesting about this crisis is that for the first time, we are seeing African leaders across the continent taking the initiative, acting in concert with their domestic constituencies, listening to the scientists in their own country. So the African Center for Disease Control has been very influential, and they have worked with many countries on the continent. And Sakina, during this time, some of the poorest countries like Uganda and Liberia, have been the first to act. And already in late January, they had developed national plans, response plans. And we have seen the result of this leadership on the continent in the numbers. The evidence tells us, we've only had 1% of the total number of deaths in Africa as a consequence of COVID-19 thus far on the continent. Things may change, but right now, African countries are showing remarkable capacity to manage the COVID-19 crisis. What this suggests to us is that, years of building this democratic institutions on the continent is beginning to pay off. And, institutions like the African Peer Review Mechanism, we are co-hosting a series of webinars this week with them for Africa Month at UCT. These institutions have been working to build resilience, and we're seeing the fruits of that. So I'm quite optimistic that we're beginning to see more trust in the leadership. We're beginning to see a greater leadership, ethical leadership, strategic leadership by the leaders on the continent. And, post-COVID-19, we hope to see African leaders striking out and showing the world what we need to do to become a more resilient and democratic society.
Just a final question, Professor Ismail, using South Africa as an example, and I guess this applies to African countries at large. The concept of beneficiation, for example, that's always been a point of discussion, at some points even a point of contention, with no movement, some would even argue in some instances. But with regard to intra-continental trade and the footprint that this has left, can we make it in manufacturing, for example, if we can't even use our own mineral resources to beneficiate the people of this continent?
So there's a long history, of African countries exporting their commodities without adding any value. This is beginning to change. In many parts of the continent, there are active attempts to develop our own industrial policies. And that means we need to take policy measures to facilitate the localization of production. We need to incentivize domestic companies to produce at home, but also to attract foreign investors to do the processing here on the continent. But if we work together and combine our resources, South Africa, for example, has tremendous capabilities and technology in agricultural processing. The continent has the largest amount of arable land in the world, over 60% of the arable land, but only 10% of this is utilized. So working together with our technology and experience and capabilities and working with other countries, we are going to be able to fast track this process after COVID-19 of building regional value chains and processing our agricultural products here at home. So similarly, in pharmaceuticals, I think there is sufficient capacity on the continent, but working together, we will be able to do it. So this was the missing ingredient. African countries were too small. They didn't have the capacity to process, to localize, to industrialize on their own. But working together, we will be able to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Faizel Ismail, a director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town, discussing how Africa could use the Free Trade Area Agreement to create a post-COVID-19 revival of the continent's economies, increasing intra-regional and intra-continental trade. And, of course, we're going to take a quick break.